Bao. I'm Associate Professor in Media Studies. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about different ways of representing transgender or trans people in Chinese cinema. And my aim is to provide a brief history and a taxonomy of trans representations on Chinese screen. So when talking about trans figures, most people think about Jin Xing, the trans celebrity in China. And of course, she is the best known trans person, trans celebrity in China. But there are also other representations which you may not know about. So most of the trans representations occur in independent Chinese cinema, that is, Chinese cinema made outside of the official studio system. So this is because of many reasons. So in the history of indie Chinese cinema, there are 5 ways to representing trans. So the first one, transgender as a homosexual prototype in earlier queer films in the 1990s. Second, transgender as socially marginalized subjects in indie Chinese cinema in the 2000s. And third one, transgender as part of the LGBTQ in queer community documentaries in the 2000s and 2010s. And then in some experimental feature films, in particular films by indie Chinese filmmakers such as Cui Ziren and Fan Popo, they also represent trans as a kind of very avant-garde queer figure. And then last but not least, trans people as part of the identity and community, and increasingly we see the kind of self-conscious representations of trans people by trans people themselves and by the kind of trans-friendly people in the queer communities. So this is pretty much my outline of the trans history of representation on Chinese screen. So before we start talking about this history, let's first define trans first. So transgender is also called trans. And of course, in Chinese, there are different terms such as 中性, 异装, and so on and so forth. And even in English, you have trans, non-binary, genderqueer, transsexual, and so on. So all those terms are different. And trans or transgender is an umbrella term to encompass all these different types of identities and embodiments. So transgender is pretty much like queer. So transgender is for gender diversity, while queer is for sexual diversity. So trans and queer are often different. And when are they connected? Well, or when are they articulated with each other depends on the historical circumstances. So for the convenience of today's talk, we are not defining trans or transgender because there are so many different understandings of transgender. Some are more essentialist, some are more social constructivist, some may celebrate and subscribe to the kind of gender affirming surgeries. Other people think that those gender affirming surgeries are not necessary, and it's okay that one identify with another gender without even have to be dressed in another gender's clothes. So there are so many different definitions and understandings. But let's understand trans as a verb, as transing. So let me quote a definition of transing from Susan Stryker, Kara, and Moore's article. In short, it is a practice that takes place within as well as across or between gender spaces. It is a practice that assembles gender into contingent structures of association with other attributes of bodily being, and this allows for their reassembly. So in other words, this trans is a transing practice where people cross their genders, cross gender binaries and embodiments, and which is uncertain, open, and contingent. And how do we study trans without defining trans, without pointing to a trans figure? So really, this requires a kind of genealogical method. This also requires us to think about how to describe historical subjects before their terms are invented. So after all, the term trans is a quite recent term. How do we use recent terms, contemporary terms, to describe historical phenomena? So Helen Liang's writing is quite illuminating here for us. So the study of transgender issues in Chinese language cinema can be more fruitfully considered as an exercise in locating moving targets. In other words, it needs not be fixated upon a singular notion of what constitutes transgender on screen. So in other words, let's chase this moving target and see what are the trajectories of such a process of chasing. Okay, so let's talk about transgender representation in queer cinema. So in a way, actually, the trans representation started when queer cinema first appeared in post-Mao China, in contemporary China. So a lot of people identify the first Chinese queer films. Some say it's Farewell My Concubine, which is a mainstream film, but with a kind of queer element in which Leslie Chung was the kind of lead actor / actress. And then some people identify it as East Palace, West Palace, which was a film made by Zhang Yuan in 1996, which portrays a kind of overnight interrogation of a gay man in a police station, actually, and this gay man happened to have some feminine attributes. So these early film texts that portray homosexuality happen to have gender fluidity or gender reversal elements. So in a way, this coincidence is not coincidental at all, because at the beginning, people's understanding of homosexuality was pretty much about male, embodying female attributes, and women who have masculine attributes. So in other words, it's very much influenced by sexologies and even by the kind of early psychology in which people believe that homosexuals are gender reversal or gender inversion. So that's why that earlier representations of homosexuality mostly take the form of transgender forms. We can also trace them as the earlier forms of transgender cinema. And I believe that many people have seen Farewell My Concubine in different ways. So let's see if I can find a trailer. Yes, there is a trailer to give you a sense of the kind of cross-dressing tradition in Chinese opera. So the Chinese queer cinema frequently goes back to the operatic mode or theatrical tradition to trace the history of transgender and the history of homosexuality. So here we go. It's a short trailer of the film Farewell My Concubine.
说的是一辈子，差一年、一个月、一天、一个时辰，都不算一辈子。
我本是女娇娥，又不是男儿郎。
你们杀了我吧！
我
Okay, so that's the film trailer for Farewell My Concubine. So, which is a kind of classic film, which basically portrays a kind of queer character as well as trans character. So, I think that the kind of China's operatic traditions, especially cross-dressing in Chinese opera theatre, has provided insights for many queer or trans representations on Chinese screen. And similarly, in East Palace, West Palace, there is also a sequence of kind of Chinese opera, Kunqu opera performance, which shapes a kind of stream of consciousness of the male protagonist. Okay, so that was earlier queer films. Into the year 2000, a lot of independent Chinese queer filmmakers, mostly straight heterosexual identified male filmmakers, started to make independent films about China's marginalized communities at the borders of Chinese society. So they cast their attention on many marginalized subjects, such as farmers, migrant workers, etc. So one of the earlier subjects that they captured in their camera was cross-dressing performers or drag performers in bars and clubs in Chinese cities. So these kind of drag performers, or we call cross-dressing performers, are some of the earliest trans representations in Chinese cinema. So this is represented by really lots of films. I've listed some, but there are many more. So I'm actually pretty surprised at first the amount of those films, second their similarities. They are all made by heterosexual identified male filmmakers who went to bars and watched drag show or drag performances, and then they were attracted by this topic or by the persona, and then they started to follow this person in a kind of observational documentary style. And sometimes people use some experimental film techniques, but those films are mostly documentaries informed by or influenced by the kind of Friedrich Weissmann's direct cinema tradition. So I think one of those best known films is Madame or Gu Nainai by Qiu Jingjiong from 2009. And what I want to add is that this tradition still continues. A new film called The Two Lives of Mao, directed by Jia Yuchuan, also features similar topics, which is trans people's lives in bars and clubs and so on. And some actually traces their lives back to their hometown and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of dramatic manipulation of plot or presentation of their journeys of transition in those stories. So let's watch a short trailer from the film Madame to get an idea of this genre. So Madame is based on a real person, a real cross-dresser in Beijing, and this person, Madame, committed suicide soon after the film was finished.
才对，暗淡的灯光，谁迷我？你不要。
What I really want to point out is that in this type of films, there's usually what is often known as transgender look. That is how transgender people appear. So the camera lenses often rest on trans people's, for example, breasts or trans people's legs, and so on. At some moment, there is a kind of obsession with those body parts. And the intention from the filmmaker was to find out, is this a man or is it a woman? So this kind of the persistent questioning on this person's gender identity and the attempt to discover the true gender characterizes this type of representation. And this type of representation is usually very voyeuristic, and it's very, in a way, objectifying. It's basically a kind of straight male gaze onto trans women's lives or body. So it is a kind of problematic representation. But of course, there are also nuances and complexities in all those representations. Okay, so that's the second type of film, which is transgender and socially marginalized subjects in indie Chinese cinema. So which is characterized by spectacle, voyeurism, fetishism, and ambivalence. So this type of films will in a way betray the kind of male dominance of the film industry. So those heterosexual males who are attracted by trans women or females and see them as kind of fetishized and exotic subjects, if you like. Okay, transgender fetishism in indie cinema, which is what I described, which is kind of the Chinese male cisgender. Cisgender is opposite to transgender. So cisgender and often non-queer identified indie filmmakers' fascination with especially male to female. You'll notice that there are a lot of trans women representation. There are not many trans men's representation. So this is, in a way, well, it's probably because the scene is more visible for trans women. But on the other hand, that also showcases the kind of the directors, the filmmakers are mostly straight male filmmakers. So bespeaks both their acute attention to and genuine care for marginalized people in society, and at the same time their unconscious male gaze, as well as voyeuristic and fetishistic ways of seeing in a patriarchal and heteronormative society. So that's kind of what indie Chinese cinema's representation of trans people by cisgender male filmmakers. But at the same time, with the development of queer communities, there are more and more gay and lesbian representations. With it, we also see many trans representations. This is pretty much because in the communities, people have accepted the idea of LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or queer. So the T, transgender, needs to be there to showcase a diversity of gender and sexual minorities. So therefore, in those community documentaries, such as those made by Cui Ziren and Fan Popo and so on, you see a variety of gender and sexual minorities, including trans people. So trans people may not be the main character in the film. However, they do exist and they appear in the film as part of the community. So that's still in documentaries, and they are what I'll call queer community documentaries, which is documentaries made by queer filmmakers for the queer audience. I talked about documentaries, so indeed most of the films that we've seen so far are documentaries because it's easy to make, it's low budget, and it portrays the society as it is. However, there are also feature films, especially of fictional experimental films. For example, again, by Fan Popo and Cui Ziren. So a lot of Cui Ziren's earlier works, such as Men and Women, Enter the Clown, Night Scene, etc., so depict trans characters in a kind of unapologetic way. So people change their genders really without any explanation or without any apology. So this is kind of really bold queer and trans representations. So trans is seen as an avant-garde queer, as avant-garde gender identity. So similarly, in Fan Pepe's recent, well not recent, 2018 film, The Drum Tower, we also see trans representation in a more experimental style. So a person fell in love or feel attracted by a trans figure. So this is based on fans, partly based on fans' experience, but it's partly fictional. And the character who appeared in this is a famous trans celebrity and trans activist, Chao Xiaomi. So let's look at the trailer. So that's Chao Xiaomi. And the film is called Drum Tower, 五楼戏. Okay, so this gives you an idea. The film is about 20 to 30 minutes long, and it can be found online. And I've got exit the screen and go back to the slides. Okay, so I think we are almost done with this brief history of trans representation, and I'll finish my presentation with some latest trends. So the latest trends for trans representation is to portray trans people's lives, their real lives. It's not their performing lives, it's not about their kind of fictional lives. They are mostly documentaries made by trans-friendly people or trans people, people in queer communities. And then, in a way, actually, trans people have more say, have more voices, and even play some kind of decision-making role in the formation of those films. So those films are mostly documentaries, and they're mostly produced in queer community video making workshops such as Queer Comrades. So the three examples that I list here, Brother 兄弟, Magic 女妖儿, and 小迪 are all such films produced by Queer Comrades. They are documentaries, and they portray trans people's lives, such as their experience of being discriminated against, their experience of taking hormone therapy, and even their experiences of having gender-affirming surgeries, either willingly or unwillingly. And I would highlight there is a recent film, 小迪 is a 2015 recently finished film, which is well worth watching. And so that's 小迪. But the trailer that I'm going to show is a film trailer from Magic 妖儿. So 妖儿 is a kind of 东北 northwest slang for trans people or
你看人下菜碟去，
必须的嘛。
别管我是什么，知道不？我在这个群里就是只是为了玩，为了让你们开心，逗你们玩。
准备回去了，现在已经这样式儿的了，我就回不去了。这么可不好，鸡蛋花打一个。
操你妈！没钱的时候他妈给我打电话聊骚，他妈你他妈有钱的时候，操你妈聊他妈别人去。
Okay, so I'm so sorry about those dirty words, but the purpose is to show that this is trans people's real lives. I mean, although it may not look bright and colorful and interesting, however, this shows the real engagement with the real trans people's lives. And they're often made by queer filmmakers or transgender filmmakers with a very sympathetic or empathetic attitude. So in this case, the kind of transgender gaze is missing because people actually have established relationship or trust with trans characters, and they are able to treat trans characters as ordinary people, not as not as spectacle or as exoticism. So now I have already traced a very brief history of trans representations on Chinese screen, and most of those films are documentaries. They are independent films. However, in mainstream representations, you often see the kind of sissy characters or kind of very dramatic depiction of trans characters. There is a very strong sense of stereotypes and objectification in those mainstream productions. But let's draw some tentative conclusions. The first one that we learned is there's not one trans character. There are different trans characters situated in different discourses. So therefore, we can say that transgender is a historical construct. It's a historical subject. It only emerged at a certain historical juncture. So that is a kind of social constructivist view of identities. So second argument is that in representing trans, the director's subject position matter. So whether it's representation by a straight cis male character or by a trans sympathetic queer filmmaker or by a trans person, they make a lot of differences. So filmmaker subjectivity shapes the kind of political stance and representations of these trans characters. But filmmaker subjectivity is not the only factor that matters. We really need to think about other factors such as genre and media. So whether it's a documentary or fiction film, whether it's a kind of independent documentary or it's a kind of mainstream documentary and so on, or it's docudrama. So all those genre matters. And also we all need to think about the filmmaker's gender sexual subjectivity, the filmmaker's relationship to the filmed subjects and so on, and the discourses where such representations are situated. So in short, trans representations are complex because of those complex configurations of relations. So we are looking forward to seeing more affirming, more positive and more sympathetic and empathetic trans representations in the future with the increasing visibility of trans people in Chinese society. Thanks very much.